Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming back today. I hope you enjoyed last night's reception. We have a pretty busy agenda today. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. We'll start strong with a panel and we ask Blake to put a good show, and with the people that we'll have on the stage, I'm pretty sure it's going to be a good show. So I'm going to introduce Blake now, Blake Schaefer, will chair the first session of the day. He's an associate professor of economics at the University of Calgary, where his research focuses on electricity market, climate policy, and energy transition. He's also an executive member of and one of the founder of the Energy Modeling Hub. So I'm pleased to be working with Blake on a regular basis. So Blake will lead this session. This is a bit different from yesterday. It's a panel which will explore the BC-Alberta Intertie's history, status, and politics, obviously. So please join me in welcoming Blake and the other speaker to the stage.
All right, thank you very much, Edouard. I want to start by thanking Edouard and Madeleine and Rachel and the entire IESVic team. This is a great event. I'm envious of your location for conferences. It's pretty good. I'm glad you left this up so people aren't just staring at the water while we get up there. So I was really excited to put this together. BC Alberta Intertie is a pet passion of mine for a long time. Madeleine said, why don't we bring together some folks who know this intimately on both the BC and Alberta side. And it's pretty interesting how we actually naturally positioned here with the Albertans, ironically, on the left side and the British Columbians on the right side over there. So I brought together, here I have with me today, I have Kevin Dawson, the Vice President of the Alberta Electric System Operator, Strategic Integration. Mark Jackard, many of you know, he's probably your PhD supervisor for many of you. He's a professor at Simon Fraser University, as well as the CEO of the BC Utilities Commission. And Mark Holman, who is the Vice President or Managing Director at PowerX, which is the trading arm of BC Hydro and really operates a lot of the trade activity between the provinces. So guys, let's just jump right into it. And I do want to say, I want to encourage questions as we go through today. The way I thought we would go through is start with some context, especially for those who aren't as familiar with the BC Alberta Intertie in terms of its activity, history, and current status. Then we'll get into the benefits of trade that we see, and hopefully we can find some consensus. But we really want to spend a lot of time talking about the barriers and challenges. Why haven't we expanded this intertie or interchange activity? So Mark, I'll kick it off with you. Let's start with some history. Trade between the provinces is not new. Can you describe sort of the long-standing history there?
Sure. Can you hear me? Great. So maybe I'll just go back, and I'm going to go back to the very beginning, other than to say that I looked up a little bit of the history, and two of the key reasons why the intertie and the connection between BC and Alberta was created was to support reliability and create the opportunity for commercial trade, where when one jurisdiction had surplus, low-cost power, they could send it to the other jurisdiction and maybe reduce generation there, and there would be economic value created in both provinces. And that was back in, I think, 1981, and I think the intertie maybe came in service around 1983. Well, that still holds today, and it's held throughout time. So now I'm going to fast forward a little bit and talk about when the markets really took off, and there was a landmark order in the US from FERC that deregulated the electricity markets. And what happened for BC was very different than what happened in Alberta. Of course, Alberta established the Alberta Power Pool and developed its own provincial market with a single energy price inside the province. BC Hydro adopted the FERC pro forma OAT for transmission service. And under that framework, BC Hydro offered open access to transmission, and at a high level sold or offers to sell and sells even to this day both firm and non-firm service. And those that invest in firm service get the priority to flow over non-firm service. So two very different frameworks. Some things have stayed relatively stable. Some things have changed quite significantly over time. So one of the things that has stayed relatively stable is the Alberta market design for well over a decade now, where they have a single energy price. People wanting to import or export energy into Alberta are price taker. So you kind of forecast the price, and then you decide how much you want to send into Alberta. Whoever has the priority rights on the BC system, or in the case of Montana or Saskatchewan tie, they get to flow, and imports and exports get the same price as generators or purchasers in Alberta. So a relatively stable framework that, of course, is about to change as Alberta is going through a significant redesign of its market, and a lot of the rules inside Alberta are changing. Some of the things that have changed, though, is the trade patterns. So we've seen periods many years ago where you'd see quite predictable overnight exports from Alberta when Alberta load was lower. They had surplus coal and gas, and the energy would get exported. And then during the daytime or on peak hours, we would see imports into Alberta. If you go back a little more recently, maybe 3, 4, or 5 years ago, really heavy on the import into Alberta side. Alberta was tight on its supply, a lot of imports coming in from BC as well as from the US into Alberta. Today, we're kind of seeing a different trade pattern. We're seeing a lot of exports out of Alberta as Alberta's had a fairly significant build out of supply that, especially during the high wind and solar hours, a lot of exports coming out of Alberta. The last thing I'll say that it's a pretty significant change and a growing concern on the BC side that we'll talk a little bit more about is the transfer capability. And so in terms of a total transfer capability from an authorized capability, WEC has a path rating where transfers from BC to Alberta can be as high as 1,200 megawatts. Transfers from Alberta to BC could be as high as 1,000 megawatts. But what we see in practice is very different than that. What we're seeing is the ability for Alberta to export either to BC or the US and enjoy that export opportunity for 935 megawatts or as high as that on a quite regular basis. But the import capability is only 300 megawatts. So we're starting to see really not a reciprocal trade arrangement because of the limited investments and actions in Alberta to support a higher level of imports. I hope that gives you a high level context to kind of how we've gotten to where we are today, how some things have stayed the same and some things have changed over time.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think you're reinforcing one point that's important to make. This isn't a one-directional line. This isn't like a pipeline for our oil to flow to the coast here in BC. This is a two-directional trade activity. Let's focus in on this, the recent derates, and I'm prepping you for this, Kevin. So like Mark said, we've got a 1,200 megawatt rated tie line from BC to Alberta that in recent years has been derated to as much as little as 300. So before even getting in the discussion of expansion, let's talk about why that is and what possible things could we do to get better use out of the existing line.
Yeah, thanks, Blake, and thanks, Mark. So to give you a bit more context around some of the operational considerations that drive those limits, it really, from an Alberta perspective, comes down to the ability of the Alberta grid to withstand the loss of the intertie. So the intertie could undergo a contingency, which means we lose that supply suddenly, and then our system needs to be able to recover from that and ensure that we maintain reliability within Alberta. So the real limiting factor at the moment is the ability of the Alberta system to recover from that, and that's really a frequency stability issue. So this is, if we lose that supply, the frequency drops off of the 60 hertz, and we need to maintain that within pretty tight bands in order to meet reliability standards that are common in all jurisdictions, really. What we've seen, I would say, is that the ability of the grid to withstand that kind of contingency has fluctuated over time. And in more recent years, like many jurisdictions, as we get more renewable generation coming in, wind and solar, which is inverter-based generation, does not provide the grid with the same amount of frequency stability that more traditional types of generation provide. And so this has become a challenging issue for the Alberta grid, and it means that it becomes more difficult to support these larger contingencies across the intertie. So there's a couple of other points I would make there. So Yes, the lowest limit on the Intertie is around 325 megawatts. But we do, as a jurisdiction, procure something called a fast frequency response service, which essentially would inject power onto the grid very quickly in the event of an Intertie trip. And with that service in place, it means we can support higher levels of imports. So partly it depends on the availability of that service, which can be market driven. And so we can see Intertie flows ranging up to say 700 or 800 megawatts in certain circumstances. We do have in Alberta regulation a mandate around Intertie restoration that basically indicates the objective for the province is to enable flows up to that path rating that Mark's talked about. The challenge has been this is really quite a technically difficult issue to solve in terms of this fast response. We've looked for demand response to provide it over time. With the emergence of energy storage, it becomes sort of more of a promising way to mitigate that issue. And then, of course, the other is the connection to Montana. The Maddle line is also connected synchronously. So Alberta connects to the rest of the Western grid, both through BC and Montana. And so the flows and the way that those lines are configured basically means that if the BC Intertie, say, trips suddenly, the Maddle Intertie also needs to be taken out of service. So we need to consider the flows on both interties simultaneously because they really form one contingency. And so we need to think about allocating that capability between the two interties, and there's some Alberta market rules that have been developed to do that.
Well, thanks. I mean, the growth of inverter-based resources, like wind and solar, not unique to us. There's lots of folks. Denmark's here. There's folks around the world. So I think it's interesting that these sort of technical hurdles we're seeing there. Lessons to learn. Is it fair to say that as you go and procure fast frequency response, or maybe look at DC converters for Maddle or things like this, that these physical challenges can be overcome? There's physical solutions to some of these things?
Yeah, there definitely are. I think, the issue really comes down to sort of the first of all, the physical availability of the supply of these things, that you can't procure what's not actually out there and available. So the first thing is, how do you incent the supply in some way or get the supply developed through a market price signal? In the case of Alberta, with a deregulated market, there needs to be some form of a price signal to get that there. But yes, they are technically possible to overcome these challenges, and it's really just getting the providers, the supply in place, which can take time. And then, of course, there's the sort of the regulatory question of the cost of that. And right now, as the regulation stands in Alberta, the loads in Alberta are the ones that pay for all of these services, and that's not just for the Intertie. That's really transmission and grid support services across the whole province. With these changing supply mix, that's now being questioned as a policy of, does it make sense to continue that cost allocation just to load? And so as a province, we're examining different allocations of that, maybe to suppliers or on a more of a cost causation basis, recognizing the changing supply mix and how that can impact the operation of the grid.
So we danced into challenges already, and I'm going to reserve that for later, but just to set context, there are current challenges on the Intertie, which these guys are gracefully discussing because it's a bone of contention across the provinces. Obviously, you have an Intertie rated much greater, and we're limiting that. There's economic opportunities being lost. We're going to come back to those, both on the economic and challenges side. But I want to give Mark Jackert a chance to chime in here. I want to shift to value and benefits. And I'm sure many people in this room, hands up if you've done modeling studies of interregional transmission. And I see Madeline waving feverishly, and Jotham, many of you will probably agree, or your instinct is there's value. So, as an anecdote, my dad, who's a retired energy economist, sort of like a plumbing business, it's father and son. He testified in the Canadian Senate, I think it was in 1982, on the benefits of Grid West. So expanding interregional transmission all the way from BC to Manitoba in greater magnitude. And here we are 42 years later trying to do the same thing. So Mark Jackard, what would you say, why now? What's changed that could potentially give a little more oomph into this conversation, or a little more buy-in?
Yeah, thanks, Blake. And that is a fun trip down memory lane. I might elaborate a bit on that first, but actually, very first, I need to make a bit of a disclaimer because as head of the BC Utilities Commission, I may eventually be on some kind of panel that is looking at issues related to what we're discussing today. So my comments really represent me as someone with some experience and an academic researcher in the energy field, and not any kind of statement from the BC Utilities Commission. There, I'm sure my lawyer's got someone planted here, and so I'm oh my goodness, I see Chris Gilmore over there. Okay.
Yeah, I'm told the lawyer is going to turn off the mic if you're about to say something.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Good. But then I will just play a little bit with your father, because I chaired the BC Utilities Commission. Some of you know that 25 years ago, I did a 5-year stint as chair of the commission. So I've mostly been a professor at Simon Fraser University, but I did that. And at the time, your father then, this is in the 90s, was the head of the Crown Corporation Secretariat. And so the government of the day had created an entity that would try to force some economic discipline onto how Crown corporations are managed in British Columbia, whether it was BC Hydro or the ferries or transit or anything else. And his work there was very impressive. But it was also a very interesting case, because both us at the Utilities Commission and he running the Crown Corporation Secretariat, we're always looking for these values. We were like, is it just value within British Columbia, but what about trade and so on? And I think in terms of what's happened since those days, I'm probably, I don't know how much I have to contribute to this panel, because I'm going to say something you all know. We're moving more to cleaner resources. Those resources are non-dispatchable in large part. And so suddenly interconnection just makes a heck of a lot of, can give much higher mutual benefits. And at the same time, there are a lot of challenges to that. So, so certainly economists and engineers are out there observing those benefits. And I can tell you regulators see those benefits. But then the regulators are at the kind of the pointy part of all of this when people start looking at the different perspectives, and what we've just heard from the excellent introductory comments here.
Yeah, you mentioned, I mean, it's a running theme through the event, and I'm sure in our minds that the growth of those variable renewable sources and the benefits of portfolio complementarity. I think it's got to be a driving force between why expanded spatial region must be much more valuable these days.
Yeah, and I think, well, because also those resources are so different. I mean, Alberta and British Columbia, even for like an energy geographer, are amazingly complementary in what they offer because of all the storage in British Columbia. So yeah, all of that, we see it. It's interesting though, and maybe I'm going off topic, but sort of environmental advocates for renewables, environmental advocates will talk about, look at how cheap wind and solar are now in cents per kilowatt hour. And people like myself, at least, they're always saying, wait a minute, the value of what's being produced here is very different, a dispatchable versus a non-dispatchable good. So talk value instead of the other. And that's what brings us to where we are today, though.
Yeah. Okay. Mark Holman, 2 Marks on a panel. Let's bring in some of your PowerX activity while you trade with Alberta. A lot of your activities in the United States, and full disclosure, I'm a former PowerX person as well. So There, it seems to me as an outsider now that they're doing a lot more in terms of regional integration, or at least attempts for more regional integration. Why are they having some success there, and we seem to be spinning our wheels in Canada?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, I think the word that comes to mind is maturity in the trade relationship. And, I think of the BC Alberta relationship, and we had a fairly stable environment for quite some time, a fortunate one because BC adopted its own open access transmission framework, Alberta adopted its own market design, and we tended to get to a place of relatively good balance where trade was working. Of course, as I mentioned, we've seen a derate in the import space into Alberta and kind of asymmetric trade now. I want to contrast that a little bit, though, with the US. In the US, for many years, we saw where entities would try to do things in their own interest without consultation to their neighbors and kind of shift the trade benefits in their direction. And saw that not only in the Western US, but even in the Eastern ISOs, seen many filings where the Eastern ISOs weren't agreeing with each other and they were in front of FERC. And I think we've seen a real maturity in the US, including in the Western US. And I'm going to talk about that in two specific examples outside of the California ISO. One is the development of the Western Resource Adequacy Program that was completed starting in about 2019, and we were a part of that. And it was FERC tariff was approved last year. And that was a group of entities getting together and saying, we've got to work together and come up with a collaborative solution that we all buy into for resource adequacy, because there's an overall societal gain. We can enhance reliability and reduce cost for consumers if we can have a joint resource adequacy program where we measure how much capacity we need on the grid, we allocate that everyone brings their fair share of capacity to meet their load plus a planning reserve margin. And then when one entity is having challenging conditions, the other entities are obligated to help them out with the surplus capability they have. Similarly, some of you may be aware that there's two different day-ahead markets being discussed in the West. One of them is SPP's Markets Plus. We've been a large supporter of SPP's Markets Plus. Very similar dynamic there, where entities realize that having both a real-time and day-ahead organized market, particularly in the context of the grid evolution today, renewables being added to the grid, rapidly emerging load growth, the retirement of base load and dispatchable fossil fuel resources, it's just too challenging to try to do it on your own. If you try to do it purely on your own, and you're not in a situation like BC or maybe Bonneville Power where you have a lot of flexible hydro, you're going to struggle. And so, but at the same time, you're not going to get anywhere with your neighbors if you think you can sit in your own jurisdiction and come up with the rules and your neighbor's going to accept those. You really need to get to a collaborative space where you're in the same room and you're adhering to certain principles. Let's maximize the trade, the aggregate trade benefits from a reliability and economic perspective. Let's come up with a equitable and durable framework for making sure those trade benefits are distributed equitably. And until you have that, you're going to continue to have challenges on trade, and you're going to continue to have challenges on expanding that trade or expanding transmission.
So on that, I'm trying to think like what allowed you to progress is part of the factor there because you almost had competing coordination opportunities. So you have the SPP Markets Plus, and I'll call it the CAISO-led Western Energy Imbalance Market. The fact that there was some competition, was that necessary?
Yeah, it's actually a good question. I would say not for resource adequacy.
Okay.
Resource adequacy came about because entities realized we're going to start having brownouts. We had a couple near misses in the Western US, and they realized that the status quo was not sustainable. It's going to affect reliability. And when the lights start going out, politicians start caring. And then it really, really matters. It really, really matters on a whole bunch of fronts. So you need to have a driver where people realize the status quo isn't going to be acceptable any longer. So resource adequacy was really driven by the heightened reliability risk because of the grid transition of the retirement of baseload and dispatchables and replacement with renewables. On the Markets Plus front, it's also, I would say it's driven by both. One was a recognition that we need a day ahead and real-time organized market, But two was that for entities that maybe didn't need that, the status quo wasn't going to exist. If you don't stand up a market with an independent, inclusive governance framework and an impartial market operator, you might get stuck having to join a market where they don't have that. And so that competition did spur Markets Plus as one of the factors.
Okay. No, it's interesting because from my perspective, what I see in BC and Alberta and working in both jurisdictions right now is those pushes towards emergency alerts in Alberta or energy deficiencies in BC the reaction doesn't seem to be looking outward, saying how can we resolve this regionally? It does seem to be looking inward in terms of, when I talk to BC Hydro, the comfort levels on these imports, even though the average price, they've been importing heavily, for those that don't know, for the last year and a half, I guess, because of the drought. How many terawatt hours would it be? 15?
I'm going to say
Something,
12 and change,
something like
in an
so.
annual basis.
A big percentage, but the average price has been around $40 Canadian a megawatt hour. So these aren't really that concerning when you think about it, but the comfort level doesn't seem to be there to rely on this regularly. Similarly, Alberta, the emergency alerts doesn't lend them towards, why don't we look to BC, look to expanded interties? What can we build that's dispatchable and firm, and maybe a look back towards gas. Kevin, can I bring in the Alberta perspective here in terms of there's so much change going on in Alberta's market right now. It's kind of an understatement, both in terms of physical supply and market design. Where do you see the value in import-export activity? Do you see this as critically important or sort of just a nice to have for Alberta?
Probably somewhere in between those two things, I would say, Blake. I think it really does, I think, start at a fundamental place of a different question, which is we have a deregulated competitive market structure. And so we look at it as ultimately what that needs to deliver is reliability and affordability. And we want to do that in a way, we want to create that market structure that creates the price signals for people to come and compete to be able to provide those things. And so I think the question is that we ask ourselves is, how do you fit Interties successfully into that structure and do that in a way that you have as level a playing field between these different sources of supply as possible, or between these different providers. So it's, I would say, less a question of like, are they critical or are they nice to have? It's more, how do they fit into the market? How do they interact and compete with other sources of supply, whether that's supply for energy or it's supply for other types of balancing services? Certainly from an Alberta government perspective, what you hear is more a focus on exports, this sort of vision that Alberta can become a net energy exporter, that's a, sort of a growth area for the province. And I would say to date that there's no specific sort of policy that has been introduced to really support that vision, but our minister has sort of talked about that in a few different public forums of like, wouldn't it be nice if Alberta, could continue to build these renewable resources and be a source of export energy for the broader WEC. I guess personally, I'm sort of like a bit more practical bent, and I would say, okay, I would like to like, what's the actual concrete plan to achieve that? So I think we're a long ways from there.
And I should say, I know we're slated to discuss and then go to Q&A, but I'm looking to my right, but if there's folks that have questions as we go through, happy to be interrupted, and I think it makes for better discussion. So please jump up if you have questions, and we can get a mic going around. Edward, you can wave frantically to me if there is one and I'm not seeing it. Yeah. What?
Yeah. There's a couple of things that we talked about on the panel. I don't want to become the rogue panel member, Blake. So shut me down. But I did want to go back to sort of like when Mark was talking about sort of the asymmetric trade, and maybe just to spice stuff up here a bit. I just would like to challenge that a little bit, because I guess the narrative from the Alberta side of the border that you hear, and our
When he said Mark, he meant this Mark.
yes, yes.
Let the record show.
Let the
Yes.
Mr. Holman. Our premier at a press conference said, Alberta's getting a raw deal from this Intertie, and not that we necessarily agree with that as the system operator, but that narrative is out there that British Columbia buys energy very cheaply out of Alberta, sends it to Alberta when the price is very high. So I would just say that's sort of an alternative view of the trade that's been happening. And my question for when you talk about asymmetric trade or benefits, I think we should unpack that a bit. What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
I'm glad you asked
Is
that.
it more than just a volume?
I'm glad you asked that question. So let's talk about market access, and let's just step away from the electricity sector for a second. Imagine let's pick a product. Let's say wine. So what if Alberta said, wine's great. We want to have the ability to export our wine to BC and to the US, and we want to transport it through BC. But our wine suppliers in Alberta, they really don't want your wine competing with ours. So we're really going to either take actions or inactions that we're going to limit your ability to sell wine in Alberta, but we want to have maximum ability to export us because we want to become a wine superpower. I think on the surface, you can pretty quickly see how that doesn't really fly on the BC side. And I've seen a lot of this all over the US, particularly in the Western US, and we've gotten to a great place. So let's talk about volume first. BC Hydro has invested and maintained transmission facilities to enable about 800 megawatts, potentially more, of imports into Alberta, and up to about 935 megawatts of exports out of Alberta. So BC Hydro is creating the transmission corridor and framework for symmetric trade opportunities. Alberta has made the choice not to make the investments on their side to enable import opportunities at an equal magnitude of export. So we're just talking volume for a moment, and then I'll get to your price piece. And so we see it as frankly not sustainable, where Alberta generators say, we love exports, our province loves exports, we want to be able to export 935 megawatts to BC and wheel through BC to the US, but we really want to limit that competition in our market from imports, and we're going to only give 300 megawatts of import capability, and we're not going to invest in some of the technical solutions that Kevin talked about, because this is great. We want to export. We don't want that. Talking about some of the generator community, we don't want the competition of the imports. That's the challenge I was talking about. Now let's talk about the economics, and let's talk about a new technology. So in the US and elsewhere in Canada, we're starting to see it, but in the US, we've seen a tremendous installation of batteries. And what batteries do in all of the markets in the US, when we're in a low-priced environment where we have high solar, high wind, market prices are low, let's say they're $20, $10, or $0, those batteries, because they're a flexible resource, they charge and they buy that $0, $10, $20 energy. And then when the grid is having higher prices, you're into the evening peak with demand higher, the solar's gone away, those batteries discharge and sell that power back at $60, $80, $100 or more. And that's part of the economics of batteries. Well, if you look at the BC and Alberta trade relationship, yes, BC PowerX on importing into the BC hydro system, and also US flexible hydro is exporting from Alberta when they're in oversupply. When Alberta is actually at $0, they have too much wind and solar, and they're going to curtail that. Entities on the Intertie are exporting because they have the batteries effectively. And when Alberta's running their gas, maybe they're in scarcity conditions, those flexible resources are importing into Alberta. I don't think that it's an unfair trade relationship for a battery to make money by providing flexibility like it does all over the US and in Europe. And I don't think it should be at all surprising or concerning that when PowerX and others are providing flexibility to the Alberta grid, they're enjoying trade income from that service.
Yeah, I recall when the premier made that comment, you know, they're buying low and selling high. This is unfair. As an economist, this hurt me quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, really what it's saying is there's no alternative domestically within the province to compete with that price. We don't have anything cheaper. I guess from a reliability perspective, oh yeah, Kevin.
So, the reason I'm bringing this up, because I think it is actually pertinent to where we're going to go on the panel. And one of the things you said, Mark, there was how BC's sort of making these investments. And I'm not doing this to pick a fight or anything, but I do I do think, like, when you look at a market like Alberta with deregulate, there's a lot of different players and voices there. And there's definitely some market participants that make those arguments that, you know, we shouldn't do this. But I think we also have to separate out and look at the stated policy and the actual actions that, for example, we as a grid operator have taken. So we've been, as a province, spending tens of millions of dollars every year buying ancillary services to enable higher volumes of imports or exports out of BC into Alberta that has been paid for by Alberta load. We maintain the Intertie on the Alberta side of the border as well. So I would just sort of challenge that you know, there are voices on the Alberta side that say we shouldn't do this. But, you know, we also have to look at sort of the stated government policy. And I think how it's relevant to what we'll talk about a bit later is this real variety of perspectives when you have sort of that kind of deregulated structure like we have in Alberta, and sort of navigating through and balancing those. So
Do you happen to know, like you've noted a couple of times, yeah, in Alberta's system, I guess in BC's as well, these transmission upgrades or ancillary services, the costs fall onto consumers, but the imports have a price effect, a dampening price effect. So has there been studies to look at what that price effect is in relation to the cost? Like, is it cost effective to buy 400 megawatts of fast frequency response to get a price drop of several $100s?
So this is where it kind of get pretty interesting of what are you looking at? What's your economic analysis of these? And you know, one thing to do is to just look at the consumer side of it, the consumer surplus side from an economics perspective. But really, I think the view is more you should be looking at the total surplus impact. And especially in a deregulated market like Alberta, there's a consumer benefit and there's a producer impact. And from an efficiency perspective, we should be looking at, you know, what's the total or the net savings or efficiency gain there. So I would say we've kind of struggled with that question, quite frankly, and different folks will have different opinions on that. When you look at that sort of total surplus gain, it's much smaller than the consumer surplus gain, and it starts to make those kind of expenditures a bit more challenging.
No, that's well, I have some questions now, but that's a good transition to some of the challenges, because when you think about the distribution of winners and losers, you know, my non-modeling intuition says consumers benefit from trade. I would say renewable generators in Alberta benefit from trade. It's an outlet for their, but peakers in Alberta, those types of generators are competed away by importers, or competed a little bit. So you have that distribution. I see Evan, then Madeline. Yeah, Evan.
Benefit accrual studies and being able to look at how we can actually start comparing apples to apples across different benefits, across different cost allocations, where there's different opportunities in different jurisdictions. Just curious if you guys could provide like a sense of where that conversation stands today between Alberta and BC. Are we having a conversation about how we can start to look at these different costs, these different benefits that different jurisdictions might have, and start trying to talk apples to apples, not apples to watermelons or whatever we're doing right now?
Up to you.
To me, I think the short answer to that is really no. Like, there's obviously sort of forums like this and academic work that looks at this, but I think from a real sort of policy setting perspective, the there's not a lot of those kind of conversations that go on. I think they very quickly start to expand into other dynamics that are going on between provincial governments. You know, it's probably no secret that sort of Alberta has been very focused on oil and gas pipeline access out to the coast. And so when you start to talk about that and expanding electricity trade, you know, I think both sides sort of very quickly start to expand the range of things that they wanting to talk about in terms of a potential negotiation. And so unfortunately not. I mean, I think that's probably, we'll get into a bit more of that when we talk about barriers. But
I'm going to answer this by speaking a little bit more to the U.S. side. And again, I would just call that it's matured more across entities, across state boundaries in terms of that dialogue happening. And when I think of, for example, expanded interties, and again, I made the point earlier and I want to reiterate it, I don't think you can expand interties until you have a meeting of minds around a durable framework for equitably distributing the benefits. Having said that, in the US, because we have a lot of collaboration down there, I've never seen a better case. I would say 10 years ago, I would say interregional transmission was expensive and didn't make sense. Today, I would say it's the low-hanging fruit that we are in. There's so many things going in the direction of expanded transmission if we can get that framework in place for durably and equitably distributing the benefits. You know, you've got decarbonization, you've got now not only diversity in load, you've got tremendous diversity in generation, right? Wind is producing in different locations at different times. You've got solar, you've got batteries, and so on and so forth. You've got almost unlimited load growth going forward. And I really think the jurisdictions that don't get serious about collaborating with their neighbors and expanding their interties with a durable and equitable framework are really going to suffer. And even the voices that block that. Think about the generator community that in Alberta, that some of them, and they're only one voice, but some of that voice doesn't want imports. I would say it's actually, is it really in your best interest? Because you may hold back load growth and economic development in Alberta if you don't have expanded transmission and can balance with your neighbors. In the US, we're able to work with our parties and identify the aggregate benefits, and there's multiple sources of that. There's reliability, there's economic, there's environmental. There is savings in the resources that get added, and then there is production cost savings. There's emission savings. Those benefits are very substantial from intermarket transmission. But again, it takes entities coming to the table wanting to collaborate and come up with that durable, equitable framework.
If I can, Blake, if I can just come in here. So it's interesting thinking about, if we get together a room of engineers and economists and look at a problem like this, and we'll say, oh my goodness, you know, wow, there are these great gains from trade. Let's get on it. But I think we're just getting starting, and Kevin's done a good job of that, of sort of saying, wait a minute, let's look at the perspective from different entities. And I have a tendency, maybe through my experience, quick anecdote, early on with something like a carbon tax, 30 years ago, I was saying yes, to my fellow economists, carbon tax is the most economically efficient policy. But are we thinking about the political context of that? An enduring carbon tax over decades? And similarly, when she's now been a colleague for several years, when Madeleine McPherson first started to get excited to me and say, oh my goodness, this has got to happen. We just need a rational dialogue here. And I was again thinking about what is the real political economy, socio-societal perspective of this. And so I might just list out a few things that are probably obvious to most people, but one of them is that, you know, electricity is a very special commodity. It is seen as so essential. And I lived through us trying to deregulate electricity markets in North America and seeing what happened when that system had some problems with it, and California had its blackout. And you realize that within a jurisdiction, people can want to say, I actually want all the reliability in my jurisdiction to be the responsibility of the politicians that I directly control through the voting process. And so they can't say to me, oh, it's the fault of that government in British Columbia why the lights are out in Alberta. And so while we might think of all these benefits to trade, those are some of the realities because the commodities we consume are different in their characteristics that they offer us in a modern society. So I'm sure you're all kind of aware of that, but I really think it is important to have those elements. We also have all these other elements here, and I won't take too much time on them, but electricity is more a provincial jurisdiction and more decentralized in Canada in terms of control, even than in the United States. Also, I will say that just thinking of the BC, Alberta, but you can see this in other parts of Canada, Ontario and Quebec. I remember issues there, but BC and Alberta, it's a bilateral discussion that needs to go on, in spite of perhaps differences between the emphasis on ecological objectives, so on how fast one gets one's electricity system to zero emission, on economic objectives. And those kind of differences are going to manifest themselves in what the objectives are that we were just talking about that Alberta might have. So we got that constitutional side, and now we've got different market structures. So, okay, now we're dealing with a vertically integrated crown monopoly. And so it's a direct agent of that government. Will this be fair in entering into our market economy and market exchanges? And I could go on from there. I will say that I'm starting to learn more in my second incarnation at the Utilities Commission about the Western Electricity Coordinating and about the work there. And I will say it's not all rosy there as well. And I know you're not saying that. The suspicion between California as a more of its own consumer perspective, and then those who might export, which is what leads to even these two competing proposals for day-ahead markets, and also just how long it's taken to try to create a regional transmission organization in the West because of different even political perspectives on electricity. So I don't want to present as like this wet blanket, forget it. But to me, you don't succeed if you're not factoring in those other broader socioeconomic political issues. So just thought that helps.
That is excellent. I think you nailed it on the head. The two key things, at least in my mind, one is this electricity reliability is a different beast. We're more than willing to be externally reliant on our supply of bananas, but we're not very comfortable being reliant on our neighbors, even within country neighbors, for peaking capacity and the lights being on. So that's something that I know people and politicians hold dear. And the other is something that you've long taught, and I've adhered to as well as a policy-oriented economist. Is economists and engineers tend to think about efficiency, economic or technical efficiency. The world works in the realm of distribution, where the allocation of those gains and losses. And if you haven't read it yet, Katie Hausman from University of Michigan has a wonderful paper out recently on interregional transmission and the barriers, and looking at the political reality of incumbents, the role of incumbents in basically blocking expansion. And we kind of danced around it, and I made allusions to it. I'm the former head trader of TransAlta, the largest merchant generator in Alberta. And so I can say with some experience, this is not in our best interest necessarily as a generator to have expanded transmission. And Katie's got this wonderful paper mostly focused on the US, basically showing that out with data, that incumbents are one of the largest impediments to interregional transmission. Everybody likes to keep the rents. We had a few more questions. Kristen, if you had one, and Madeline. Oh, Madeline first.
Yeah, I've got kind of a two question. Is this working? Oh, it is. Okay, great. And so I'm sort of hearing two issues here. The first on sort of the ancillary services, system stability side of things. And I want to invoke some of our international folks in the room here too. I mean, we've got Ireland, over 35% wind generation, Denmark over 50% wind generation. I mean, these countries crossed the barrier or the threshold of wind penetration that Alberta has now 25 years ago, and have, deregulated markets that have managed to clearly procure sufficient system services to keep the lights on. So I think the first part of the question is, are there lessons? Like, what are these other jurisdictions doing to procure those system services despite way higher penetrations of wind, decades ago? And then the second part of the question is around the cost benefit analysis. Again, we can look to these jurisdictions that have developed cost benefit analysis frameworks, where TSOs in Europe do their own CBA analysis, and only when an intertie has a positive CBA analysis on both sides of the border does then the conversation go forward. So again, in these, everywhere in the world, an intertie is changing the winners and losers, right? There's consumers winning, there's suppliers losing. That's the story of interties everywhere in the world. That's not a unique story to us. And yet there are these frameworks that other countries have developed to sort that, to at least quantify that. And if it's not a positive CBA on both sides of the border for both TSOs in Ireland, then the project doesn't go forward. But if it does, then it will. So I guess sort of a two-part question, like on these two issues of ancillary services and cost benefit analyses, we have jurisdictions who have, I don't want to say sorted this out, and they would certainly say they haven't sorted this out, but who are, way further ahead in terms of developing markets that procure ancillary services and developing CBA analysis to do this. So can we look to them? Why aren't we looking to them for some inspiration here on how to do this?
Yes, we absolutely can look to them, and I think we are looking to them. I think we're definitely, and beyond just the sort of the interconnection and intertie question, but the broader question of the evolving markets for these different types of balancing services. And I can speak for Alberta that we're absolutely looking at what's going on in other jurisdictions, and we're undergoing major market reforms right as we speak that are incorporating some of these concepts to help with the balancing and all of these issues. So that is underway. And yeah, I don't want to give the impression that these are not solvable problems. They're definitely lots of models that we can look to and that we are looking to. I think there are what I've learned is that every jurisdiction is a little bit unique, and so you do have to consider the uniqueness of the jurisdiction. We do have some operational uniqueness in Alberta that we have to think about. We're actually one of the few jurisdictions that can become completely islanded just through a single sort of contingency. And so we have to think about that operationally. And so one thing I would point to is, in these other jurisdictions, for whatever reason, like they probably all have their own kind of path-dependent history, but they may be starting from a place where they're already more interconnected, or they're starting from, in the case of Europe, there just may be a stronger centralized policy development process that has enabled them to sort of set up these things to do this cost benefit analysis that don't exist yet in our context. So we can certainly look to them to learn from them. Personally, when I look at what's going on in the States, and there's a FERC order 1920 that really talks about a lot of the cost benefit or the benefit measures that Mark was referring to. That's a great thing to look to, and we're looking to that. Again, not just for interties, but for transmission development in general in Alberta, because we're right in the middle of reviewing our transmission policy and sort of probably moving towards more of this cost benefit type of assessment. So definitely we can learn from it. Yeah, I just think there's like different starting places that people are coming from that you have to consider when you look at where they are and what they're doing.
If I can just, I mean, I'd like to point out Ireland is a literal island, so they do have some of these challenges. If I can poke fun at more strongly, in terms of, I've been heavily critical of the ASO to the point that many of them, except Kevin, don't like me right now. On one of the reasons for the technical challenges in Alberta is a little bit about being caught off guard in terms of the need for fast frequency response because of just the rapid growth of renewables that I think probably everyone in this room was willing and capable of forecasting was coming. But the long-term forecast continually under forecast the growth of wind and solar. So as a result, they weren't quite ready for this. And feel free to pounce on me, Kevin. But I don't think they were ready for the deficiency in reliability services in the province. So playing a bit of catch up, I think. And my view is that'll be resolved within a year or two. Did you have something to add on that, Mark?
No, I was just going to say that I really appreciated the comments that Mark Jacquard make. Like, we really do need to think about this as more than just an economic or modeling perspective. Those other perspectives are really important, especially if you want to have success. You know, I think about the political side and, you know, who are the powerful voices. And I just wanted to touch on that a little bit, which is, and again, it's not all rosy out there. The examples I gave in the US were the Western Resource Adequacy Program and Markets Plus, where you really do have collaboration, but you have other cases where entities are very much, as Blake said, holding on to their rents. And so, you know, you could almost align the import jurisdictions that have asymmetry in their export capability versus their import capability. It often aligns with which voice has greater political power. So we see jurisdictions where they really want to see low wholesale prices. The load is buying from merchant generation and imports, and they don't really have an appetite for expanded export transmission capability. They like having all the generation and maybe the wind and the solar kind of trapped in their jurisdiction because it keeps the prices low. We see, you know, candidly in Alberta, the generators have a very strong voice and they have been vocal and transparent. This is, again, not the AESO, not the system operator, that they like exports, but they really don't like the imports coming in. So we got to recognize that this is not just this is not a technical, insurmountable challenge. Certainly there is technical challenges, but we've seen much bigger technical challenges overcome. It really is a need to get to the point where asymmetric trade is not durable. It doesn't tend to continue. The other jurisdiction usually doesn't allow it to have a declining situation on the trade front, and that's not a good outcome. And that the world has changed, and both the generator and load community can benefit from expanded trade, but they really got to come to that realization. Like I said, I think it's just tremendously changed where imports or exports aren't eating someone's lunch, so to speak. It's actually expanding the opportunity to electrify your economy and grow your economy, and that creates more opportunity for the generators.
Kristen.
Thank you so much. This has been such an interesting panel so far. I don't want to repeat some of the points that were already made about the importance of the bilateral trade agreements to really maximize on both sides of the borders for an interprovincial intertie the economic benefits. I am just sort of curious, though. I've heard a lot of criticisms, not just about the Alberta-BC intertie, but other interties across Canada, and about them being underutilized on one side of the border or not sort of fulfilling kind of the economic and technical dreams that led to the intertie being built in the first place. I'm sort of curious, just asking the panel, do you think it's even possible to really maximize the benefits of any intertie in Canada without a neutral third party balancing authority overseeing
it? Spent a fair bit of time in the Western US thinking about this. So one way to maximize the utilization of an intertie in both directions and the benefits is to be part of a single market. So you design one market and it expands, for example, multiple provinces. The reality is there are very significant political and other challenges to achieving that. We've been spending some time with other entities out there figuring out how can we maximize or achieve largely that result in a multi-market framework. And so as an example, Southwest Power Pool has its own RTO in the east, plus they may end up being, or likely will be, the market operator for a significant part of an organized market in the West, there's already dialogue around how they can take charge of the transfers hour to hour, even interval to 5-minute interval to 5-minute interval between, to fully utilize those interties and then have a framework for distributing those benefits back to the entities that are funding the facilities in both jurisdictions. So that dialogue is taking place, and I actually find it very promising, very exciting, because I think it's nice to think academically about a single market with common rules and one operator dispatching all the generation. I don't see that in the near term happening, across Canada, for example, but a new framework for market to market transfers being conducted by an independent entity with an agreed to arrangement for the benefits to be distributed, I think that holds a lot of promise.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the great discussion. My name is Nathan Green. I'm a regulatory lawyer with Bennett Jones, and I have a couple of questions. First, for Mark Holman, I'm curious to hear how much capacity for wheeling through BC is there, and how much is actually happening? My second question to the panel as a whole, I really appreciate the discussion around jurisdiction, and I think it's important to remember too, Alberta, to some extent, is much more geographically isolated from load than BC is. And so what are your thoughts about a new path from Alberta, say, for example, straight to BPA, to open up a new way for trade that's not exclusively subject to BC jurisdiction?
I'll take the first one. So the transfer capability, I'm just going to use the most typical numbers. And so most typically we see from Alberta to BC, 935 megawatts. It can be below that in certain circumstances, but 935 megawatts. From BC to the US, we typically see that be about 2,400 megawatts. And so you could think about that 2,400 megawatts is available for BC exports, but also up to that 935 to go from Alberta to the US. And of course, that 935 can also go from Alberta to BC. I don't think that Alberta is dependent, of course, on any BC market. BC has adopted an open access transmission tariff under the FERC, consistent with the FERC pro forma tariff. So that transmission is available for both purposes. There's a competitive process for securing firm versus non-firm rights and different durations. I'm hoping I've answered your question in terms of the opportunity there for transfers.
I'm hoping to hear about the difference between the actual capacity and what is actually happening by private market participants in Alberta to wheel through. Is that a missed opportunity? Is it an opportunity that's being prevented somehow? And how is that a part of the political discourse or not?
Today, so you're talking about in one direction, right? Alberta exporting either to BC or the US. Under today's framework, I would say, generally speaking, that activity is happening to the maximum extent possible when the economics are there. So if Alberta prices are relatively low and BC PowerX is wanting to purchase that energy and has transmission rights, or a US entity in, say, Washington or Oregon has transmission rights and wants to purchase that power, that is happening. There's really not a lot of inefficiency there. You do have to be a price taker and forecast the price in Alberta that it's going to be low, but we're seeing that fully utilized to the extent the opportunity is there for the most part.
Since I picked on Kevin earlier, I got to throw something at you. How much of that firm transmission rights, though, are purchased currently by BC Hydro and PowerX in a long-term nature?
You know what? I don't know it off the top of my head, but in that direction, what I'll say is I think, top of my head, there's 500 megawatts of firm transmission. I think there were 535, and I think the remaining is only sold as non-firm. Historically, it wasn't always fully sold on a long-term basis. We've secured some of it. Some of the Alberta parties have secured some of it. And there's actually ongoing competition in the BC Hydro transmission queue to secure that. I would have to look on a month-by-month basis to say who currently hold, how much do we hold versus different Alberta parties hold.
Yeah, I would sort of, in terms of the real-time utilization, I would agree with Mark. I think the there's not a lot of evidence that the transmission that's available is not being efficiently used. I think the question more becomes that what is that volume limit, and then how and when does it get increased? Your question about the line directly from Alberta to BPA is, I think it kind of gets at the heart of a lot of this this challenge that we face. Because is it a good idea or not? I don't know. I think it kind of depends on a lot of the sort of the view of like the competitiveness of the transmission going through BC and all those things. So that's hard to answer. But I think when you think about if it was a good idea, how would it actually happen? Like that's the thing that I think about. Is it's really hard to envision that you know, the question is who would build it and how, and who benefits from it, and how do they capture that benefit? And I think this really gets to the heart of a lot of the issues we've been talking about, of the sort of the jurisdictional and especially the allocation of the costs and the benefits. Because I think to see something like that built, you really need to answer those questions. Because you know, we could do things up to the Alberta border, but from that Alberta border through, you know, to the Western Seaboard, you know, there's probably a number of utilities and transmission providers that would be involved in that. And so you'd have to work with all of them to figure out, you know, the costs of building that, operating agreements, all of those kind of things. That's really gets to the heart of the challenge that we face here.
One thing on your question too, I'm thinking about the Montana-Alberta Maddle line. Kevin mentioned before, both the Montana line and the BC line connect in Alberta into the WEC. And so if there's a frequency event, both lines can effectively get curtailed. So as a result, they derate the lines collectively. Maddle has long had a potential to upgrade their line, do a DC conversion on it. I think it's Berkshire Hathaway owns it. But there's hesitancy there because will they appropriate all of those benefits? There's obviously private benefits of doing that. They'd upgrade a line that's rated at 300, but currently limited to about 150, I think, typically. It moves up and down, but they would get the full extent to that if they did a DC conversion on both sides of the line. They get those private benefits, but they'd also provide reliability benefits to Alberta that they're not clear on whether or not they'd appropriate that. So I guess that gets back to your original thing about making sure the agreements for coordination of benefits are there, because they're not even doing that, let alone a larger line. And a line right into BPA seems challenging in my mind, because even that Maddle line connects into a weak spot and it's east of that Hathaway constraint in BPA. So it's not a very good location to connect into. They could clearly do more across BPA for east-west transmission, but they'd want to clear their own stuff first before bringing in more Alberta. Yeah.
I think the other thing too is it also brings up I think a fundamental challenging point when you think about increasing connections. You know, we talk about east-west within Canada. I think it applies to this, but also north-south is like just the geography involved and the space and you know, that essentially creates a cost of. There's lots of distance to challenge or to cover. When you look at Alberta, for example, like, you know, what's south of us? Montana. There's not a lot of people down there. You've got to go pretty far south geographically to get to loads and like really liquid markets. And so this is where I think when you run the cost benefit numbers, then you start to sort of really have to say, you know, what are the alternatives to this? And I'm not saying we shouldn't do this, but I just think like that is partly an explanation for why we are where we are, sort of where, you know, most of the trade goes north-south and there's not a lot of east-west, is because that's the economic opportunities have always, for all of the province, have been to the south to feed the US markets because they're so much bigger and more lucrative. And that partly explains why we're not as interconnected as we are as a country.
There- I just want to add one thing I think is really important to recognize because I really appreciate what Kevin just said. North south, especially when you go longer distances, has a greater opportunity than east west. North south, I see right now when I look at the entire western region, including BC, Alberta, and all the western states, the single greatest opportunity I see sitting in my chair is BC in the northwest to the desert southwest. And that is because you get both load diversity and resource diversity. You look at BC and Alberta, and again, I think there's a great opportunity for expanded trade if we can get over some of the issues and hurdles we talked about this morning. There's not a lot of load diversity, right? You look back at what we often call in the West, the Martin Luther King weekend and that cold snap back in January earlier this year. Well, it was pretty coincidental that, BC was hitting a record peak load, and I think Alberta was just a day adjusted and experiencing really high demand. You look at some of our trade activity with entities in Arizona, and it's like, they've got tremendous amount of surplus in the winter. I think there was 5,000 megawatts coming up to the Northwest during that cold event. So they've got load diversity and resource diversity. They can tremendous solar resource down in the Southwest, really high intensity, low cost, summer peaking. You look at the BC hydro system, I think the winter peak's about 2,500 megawatts or more higher than the summer peak. So you got seasonal load diversity. So again, great opportunities across Canada, but we just got to not overstate that there's much greater opportunities in the north-south direction.
Great point on the load diversity. Mark, Jack, are going to come to you on resource diversity. And let's bring in political constraints. Because this is something I've been thinking of. BC's in the midst of a call for wind power, 3 terawatt hours here. And who wants to take the little harbor ferry across to the legislature and tell Premier Eby, instead of buying 3 terawatt hours at probably $80 would be my guess is what we'll pay. I'm gonna have some wagers later. Why don't you get Alberta workers to build wind for the $30 and $40 we're building it out there? So those political realities that it is inherent in any trade relationship about where are the jobs versus the economic benefits. How do we overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the production of energy resources side of it that you're giving as an example. But even in this and so yes, I mean, how do you overcome that? In certain political contexts, it's going to be pretty difficult. It's interesting. Don't know how many people notice this, but because I get media printouts now, in the last 8 months leading up to the British Columbia election, we had a concerted effort by certain groups, they were called Energy Futures, to say not only that we should stop having our system in BC be planned for average water years, but it should be planned again as it was a while ago for low water years, which means again less trade, and hopefully we can sell that surplus then in most years. But that was the energy issue. And then on the capacity issue, it was, we've got to really worry about our winter peak time. So what we ought to do is slow down the conversion of buildings to electricity, of vehicles to electricity. Do you remember that so much of your energy system is reliant on fossil fuels? And so slow down that process. So I guess I'm really saying the same thing I said before, which is it really is that intra-regional focus that can be such a challenge. But that leads me to sort of a fun question to throw out there, which I think I threw out to my staff within a few days of starting my job, was who could be the instigator of any progress down this path? Like, is it the local utility commissions or AESO or the Canadian Energy Regulator would love to have this role, and historically they haven't even tried to play that role, and there's reasons for that. It probably goes back to Quebec and and don't meddle with anything Hydro-Quebec is doing. Is it that our connections with the Americans might help out? Because at the time when we were moving towards market electricity systems, a lot of it was really driven by what FERC was doing in the United States to try to increase access and fair rules of transmission. And so I guess I'm not answering the question I just posed. But if we're sitting here holding conferences on how to make this thing happen, I hope people are also thinking about that institutional side, because I've been thinking about it a lot, and it seems pretty challenging. I guess that's what I'll say.
And maybe you're coming into there, and I guess one question I'd have is, and what role for the feds in this traditionally provincial arena, where you hear from federal, not ministers, but the people at NRCan, people at CER, people ECCC, they would love to see more interregional transmission. And sometimes they want to overstep in terms of their role. So what role, if any, do you see the feds having in enabling this process, or are they an impediment?
So again, I don't want to be guilty of talking about the old days, but in the 90s, when it was the vogue to move to competitive markets and therefore transmission access, every jurisdiction had to look into perhaps doing what Alberta eventually did, and Ontario went part way. And in British Columbia, I did 2 inquiries for the government in the 90s, one in 96 and one in 98, a task force on bringing competition into our system in British Columbia. And that's where at least we had wholesale competition for new supply by independent power producers to then have a contract with BC Hydro. But for a brief time, the government followed my recommendation and separated out hydro transmission. But the real driver for them doing this, I remember the federal government showed up and said, hey, we got some ideas. And everybody said, get lost. You have no power here. But the things that FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, was requiring, even for BC Hydro, to, had to have reciprocal arrangements on access to its transmission if it wanted access through Bonneville's system, for example, to California. So in the United States, so the irony is, we made progress in Canada in having like tariffs and so on because of what FERC was deciding in the United States. Now, would that be able to replicate itself now? I don't see the path how that happens.
I think there's money talks, free money. So I think the government has, to some extent, the federal government has to some extent gone down that path a little bit with the talk of some funding support for it. So I think, that to my mind, that's maybe like the most promising avenue of getting some more interprovincial, is if the funding comes from the federal level, so that at the provincial level it's a much easier sale to your ratepayers, because you're just paying it in a different way, and so it's not as visible. And there's all kinds of sort of cross-country equity considerations involved in that. But I think that some type of funding from the federal government might be a practical way of pushing it forward.
Yeah, I would say it is leaning a little bit on the US. What we've seen out of the US in recent years is what Kevin just said, funding. So funding can certainly help. I would say that, I think about FERC, and I think about Department of Energy in the US, and I think about how would you apply that here. I would say funding and enabling and supporting, but falling short of driving. And even when you look at all the transmission we're seeing built in the US, in virtually every case, you can identify the one or more suppliers and the one or more purchasers, at least in one direction, that want that project to happen and are behind it. And so you need that too. You need to have the entities that are going to use the line, someone on each end of that line that's saying, I want this project to happen. The feds are helping funding it. They're helping support maybe a cost allocation framework, et cetera, and so forth, but they can't do it on their own. And, I'll give you another example, is not on transmission, but I remember when the federal, FERC in the US tried to
effectively impose standard market design, and that did not go well in the US, and they backed right away from that because it was, I think, going too far and kind of the federal government trying to play a role of making it happen in all ways. And so you need the support, enable, hopefully funding, and then you need at least a couple of parties, one on each end of the line at a minimum, to want to make that project happen.
Yeah, on that one, I actually a year ago reached out to my colleagues at Enercan and said, I'm willing to be an emissary of connections on both sides of the line. This is my passion project, and I'll get this to the table. And they said, yeah, and we have lots of money to put at this, but until we see a concerted commitment from the Albertan stakeholders that matter and the BC stakeholders that matter to getting this across the line, that they want to be at that table to even start hammering it out. The feds didn't even want to come to the table because they didn't see that commitment yet. So on that dour note of where we're at, do we have any last questions? Oh, we do.
Is it working? Yes.
Yes.
I'm Jennifer Mowell from ECCC, and I just had a question for Kevin. You mentioned when you were responding to Madeline's question that AESO is currently considering or implementing market reforms to facilitate expanded trade. I was just wondering if you could expand on what those reforms are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say the market reform, I wouldn't characterize the market reforms as being directed at expanding trade. I think they're really more directed at modernizing our market to recognize a very rapidly changing supply mix, and a supply mix that has far more volumes of variable renewable generation that needs to be integrated successfully into the system. And so we're seeing a lot more variability of production. And so we're looking at putting market reforms in place that essentially incent more flexible resources and the ancillary services, the grid balancing services that go along with that to maintain a stable grid as we expect the volume of these types of resources to continue to increase going forward. I think along with that, so there's sort of like the operational, having the market create the price signals that get resources that can provide the flexibility. There's also the question of having a market which can drive investment to continue to have sufficient supply added into the market. And so I think those are really the kind of the two core elements of the market reform, of being able to continue to have a reliable and affordable system as we integrate more and more sort of low carbon generation, and a lot of it being variable renewables, and ensuring that the market can continue to attract the required investment, recognizing that these resources can have the market dynamics are changing. Markets becoming more variable. The supply is, as we know, renewables, zero cost of production. So there's more of a shift towards, once the upfront capital investment is made, the operating costs can be quite a bit lower. So this changes the market dynamic in a wholesale electricity market, and it really needs to reflect that. So that's what the market reforms are really focused on.
Thank you.
Any last questions? Peter?
Is there, you're currently with IEEE Spectrum, among other leading publications. Is there a role or any, legal route to merchant transmission in Canada?
We might go to Kristen. We might call a friend.
I would say that in Alberta, we've got a real life example of a merchant intertie, which was developed in the Montana-Alberta tie line. So that, I think, would be one benefit I would point to of a deregulated kind of structure, is that it's probably easier for those types of projects to be proposed and actually connect into the system.
I know also like something to consider here in BC, elsewhere too, Alberta, where you're getting these large loads come in and there's connection times with the utility, that this is often discussed as one of the potential avenues to speed up that process, where you can allow some of these potential grid services to come off of single system operator.
Yeah, I just added that a little bit in that merchant transmission, when we see it, you know, Maddle was kind of the exception. It was many years ago, and as Blake pointed out, we're not even seeing the will to invest to convert it to DC and get it fully rated. I think you need, as a merchant developer, you need either one of two things to ensure you're going to get the benefits going back to the entity that funds the line. You either need, and it could be and or, long-term power deals where someone's got a long-term arrangement, a generator to a load, and they've agreed to pay the cost of the merchant line, and that arrangement's kind of solidified for a long-term period. Or you need a durable framework within, for example, the organized markets, where you trust that over more or less the life of the line, the resource adequacy benefits, the congestion rent's going to go back to that transmission line, and that the market prices that are being computed at the point of receipt and point of delivery are accurate and appropriate. And if you don't have a way to say, I know I'm going to get the appropriate share of benefits back to the entity that funds the merchant line, it's hard to see how that merchant line moves forward.
Okay. So I think I'll wrap it there. We're mostly at time. I would just end on two notes. One is that I hope your kids are not sitting in a similarly lovely room, probably on hover chairs, 42 years from now, having this same conversation. I hope we've progressed. And second, sincerely, I'd like to thank the panelists for taking time out of their busy days to be here in Victoria. So thank you very much, guys.